have flat if there is.
Testing.
I think it's on.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for making it to this early morning session. So, as you know, our session deals with fixers, their relationship with news organizations, freelancers, and their role in the general journalism community, because they do a ton load of work, especially researching, making sure that foreign correspondents are safe in difficult situations in different countries, so on and so forth. So today we have a very diverse panel of journalists, fixers, editors, and all. So we have Ms. Anna Craig, we have Bobby Ghosh, and Rajesh Prabhakar. So just throwing the stage open to them.
Okay. How do you want to do this? You want to?
Yeah, I think Rajesh could start with his perspective of being a fixer. How does he go about doing his work and the challenges he faces?
Hello, good morning. My name is Rajesh Prabhakar. I'm a fixer, and I'm from the Asia's largest slum called Dharavi. Maybe you can say the world's biggest slum, Dharavi. And been living in Dharavi for a long time. I started my fixing job from last 12 years. Not formally trained as a journalist, but as an ongoing, like working with journalists and news crew. So that's how I started.
Mr. Ghosh, throwing the question to you now. You worked with numerous fixers over your tenure at Time magazine, and just wanted to know, like, there are countless times when sometimes drivers become photojournalists, or sometimes people who are not trained in journalism become very good journalists or fixers, basically, doing the groundwork. So could you highlight some points about the challenges that fixers face with regards to training, security?
Okay. Well, I think this audience would be quite familiar with the nature of the risks that fixers in many parts of the world take, especially when we're talking about fixers in combat zones, in war zones, or in places where there is a repressive government, or there are authorities that seek out to punish anybody who collaborates with foreigners, and especially those who collaborate with foreign journalists. I've had the good fortune of working with fixers in many parts of the world, some in countries where there is no conflict and things are perfectly hunky-dory, and then many in countries that are in various states of distress and conflict. And obviously, the definition is a very broad one. The four of us on the panel have been talking since yesterday evening about the very word fixer. In our experience, many people who perform that role hate that title. So we are trying to come up with a better better name for it, better label for it. And Iona, just before we came in, came up with the flash of inspiration and said maybe we call them field coordinators, because that's what they do. They coordinate. It sounds a little more elegant than fixer. And it's actually a much better description of the work they do. And you're right. Some of them started out as drivers, security people, cooks, in one instance that I know of. And then they, working with journalists, they realize that they can learn some of the skills with journalists and photographers. They also realize that their local knowledge is something that is incredibly valuable. And sometimes it comes from working with journalists that understanding of the value of that local knowledge is unlocked in a certain way. They knew all these things all along. They just didn't realize that these things had value and could be useful to somebody. So yeah, I've worked with, I could tell stories about the amazing journalists, coordinators that I've worked with. But I think that'll become a long fireside chat, and maybe we save that for later.
Ms. Craig, you worked extensively in Yemen, have won so many awards and stuff like that. So I just want to know your perspective on working with fixers in Yemen, despite knowing the local language. Local people open to sharing their experiences with you, or how do you go about your work?
I think my experience has been particularly as a freelancer, and the people that we work with, even for large media organisations, they don't have a protocol of how to offer support for those we rely on in the field, particularly if things go wrong or they need to be, in worst case scenario, evacuated, and even sort of with payment. You know, as freelancers, we pay people a lot less because we get paid a lot less than large media organisations or TV crews would who are coming into the field. And also, we therefore provide a lot less backup for them if things do go wrong, despite relying on them very heavily. I hate the term fixer as well, and I've been struggling to come up with another one. The sort of people who helped me in Yemen, I was living there for 4 years, and now because of the conflicts, I have people in kind of each city across the country who I rely on. And I jokingly then started referring to them as my angels as an alternative, and one of them turned around and said, yes, that's appropriate because when we work with you, we know we're getting closer to heaven. Yeah, I rely on them extremely. I call them my friends. I not only use them for helping me with my work, but often I'll be staying with them and their families. I know all their children. I've known them for many years. And I'm very aware that if something does go wrong, that I don't have the capacity to be able to get them out of the country easily or necessarily look after them. And in the 8 years now that I've been covering Yemen, only once as a freelancer has a media organisation said, what about the fixer and insurance for them? Because as a freelancer, it's always a battle getting that paid for yourselves. And I think there has been a shift in the last couple of years now with organisations like the Frontline Freelance Register that has set out this code of conduct for freelancers when they're working with large media organisations about putting responsibility on those media organisations as well as the freelancers taking responsibility for some issues as well. And I think what we really need is the same for fixers, really, so that they do have some form of support mechanism, that there is an organisation that they can go to for advice. We were talking about this outside, and it was something that Bobby raised as well. And I think we have moved on with recognising that freelancers need more support, and we're still a long way off that with fixers. I messaged one of my angels in Aden yesterday, and he got back to me this morning, and I said, what's your biggest issue? And he said, I hate the name fixer, and also the issue is the recognition. And, you know, as he pointed out, sometimes we do up to 50% of the work, but we don't get the recognition for it, particularly in print journalism. If you're doing TV work, often they will get a credit, but in print journalism, very rarely will you even get an acknowledgement at the bottom of a report. Sometimes there are security issues with that, and that's a responsibility that we have as well. And trying to find the balance between that is giving fixers a recognition or coordinators a recognition for their work without putting them in danger when you're working in a conflict zone in particular. And again, the issue over awards as well. I think, you know, as journalists, we get kind of all the glory, and those that have been instrumental to our work in the field don't get any of that. The Kirk Short Memorial Awards just started up a Fixers Prize last year, but to the best of my knowledge, that's the first time that's happened, and they're the only awards outlet, if you like, that are doing that. And I think there needs to be a lot more credit given to those that are helping us in the field, and a way of recognising that as well, because otherwise we're just getting all the glory when they're doing a lot of the work.
Yeah. So now, coming back to you, Mr. Ghosh. So do you...
Mr. Bobby, please. Mr.
Okay.
Ghosh is my father.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Bobby. So,
Not Mr. Bobby, just Bobby.
Okay. So the next question is: do international news organizations skirt over their responsibility when it comes to fixers?
Some do and some don't. In the time that I worked at Time Magazine, I'm proud to say that on every occasion that the organization needed to step up, it did. In the time that I was in Iraq, for instance, we had one fixer killed, 2 severely wounded, nearly died in an IED explosion, 2 others kidnapped and tortured, and around a dozen of them threatened and forced to leave the country, several of them forced to leave the country. On all of those occasions, the magazine, the company stepped up and did what was right. Providing money, providing, helping them to leave the country when necessary, helping them get medical evacuation and medical support. But in each instance, I had to ask. I had to send a note to New York. The chief of reporters, a wonderful gentleman, he then took the matter to the editors. The editors immediately said yes. Then the matter went to the finance department to spring the money. They said yes. But in each occasion, a series of individuals had to step up. What I'd like to see in organizations like this is a system. This should be automatic. This should not require a request as such. It should not be dependent on the whims of an individual at any given moment. It should be automatic. It should be written in stone. So basically, what I would love to see is in a gathering like this is perhaps not today, but we put our minds together, all of us journalists, editors as well as reporters and fixers, and come up with a set of principles and protocols that all news organizations can adopt, and let's call them the Perugia principles for fixers or coordinators, whatever the correct word is, and let's have a discussion about what they should be on recruitment, on remuneration, on rewards, on recognition. And then what responsibilities you have to the organizations or individuals have to these fixers after the transaction is complete, after the assignment is over. These are not normal assignments. There are instances, and I know from my personal experience, where a fixer working for an organization in a war zone is essentially putting themselves at risk not only for the duration of the assignment, but in some cases for the rest of their lives, or certainly for a long period after the assignment is over. So it's entirely possible, and I live with this nightmare all the time, that it's entirely possible that 10 years from today, and that will be 25 years since the start of the Iraq War, 10 years from today, one of the Iraqis who worked with me at Time Magazine's bureau in Baghdad might be picked off in the street and hurt, heaven forbid, worse, just because once upon a time he used to work with an American publication. What is the responsibility that these organizations have for those individuals? And how long does that responsibility, should those responsibilities continue? Can we create a series of guidelines and resources that maybe are available online? Can we create a system of SOS where a fixer in distress may not have immediate access to the reporter with whom she or he worked? Can they create an alert system by which they send a signal of their distress, and then can we create a system where not just an individual organization or not just a freelancer, but the full weight of the profession of journalism is brought to the assistance of this individual. That's the kind of thing I think we need. As Ayana said, if we are beginning to form these principles for freelancers, why not do those for fixers as well?
Okay. Now, bringing gender to the forefront, just want to know, your experiences working with female fixers versus male fixers, and what kind of perspectives do you get when you have a female fixer and you go to countries like Yemen or Afghanistan and all? Just want to understand it.
Well, in Yemen, sometimes it's essential, particularly when you're in the rural areas. As a foreign male, you wouldn't get access to the female population at all in those kind of circumstances. And certainly if I went with a male fixer who is even Yemeni, they wouldn't be allowed to meet with the women or the families. So in those kind of circumstances, I will always take a female with me, a Yemeni woman, to help. And they're kind of essential in that work. Otherwise, you're limited to kind of 50% of the population. You'll never get access to speaking to the women and a lot of the younger children, because society is segregated in that way, and particularly so in the rural communities. So they're really important for that kind of work. And again, on the flip side, when I've, particularly now in the course of the conflict, is meeting with some of the Salafi militia leaders, they would never do that if you had a female Yemeni translator or fixer with you, and therefore you need a man. So often when I'm doing some of my reporting, in particularly in rural Yemen, is you need both. You have to have both a female with you and a male, even though I can get by speaking enough Arabic. As an outsider, particularly in some of those very remote places in Yemen, it's much better to have a Yemeni with you. And also because the local dialect is often so strong that trying to understand some of the dialogue is really, really hard. And so, yes, the female fixers play a very important role in that. I wouldn't be able to do a lot of my work without that. I have to say, I've never, in all that time in Yemen, had an issue, gender issues in that respect, of people either refusing to meet me or be interviewed because I'm a woman. It's not been an issue. But yes, with a male fixer with me, there's no way I'd be able to go and speak with a lot of the women and the families in Yemen. So that is something you have to bear in mind.
Okay. Next question is regarding credit. So a lot of fixers complain about not receiving credit for the stories. Sometimes they go and find the stories, pitch, do groundwork, come up with case studies and stuff. So is there a uniform system where maybe posthumously they could be credited, or even somewhere down the line when the situation's safe, they could be credited for their work? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think these should be part of the principles. Where can in what instances, in what circumstances, can a fixer / coordinator be given a joint byline or a reporting credit or recognition of some kind, where it is in their interest not to be given that? Sometimes, they have to make that call. Sometimes in their enthusiasm, they may not always see that it's not in their best interest, and so they must put their head together with the reporter and make that call. But we should also recognize that these situations sometimes are temporary. It could be that today, giving credit to a reporter in Yemen, let's just say, to give a credit to a local fixer, maybe putting them at risk, and you don't want to do that. But God willing, 5 years from now, things get better in Yemen and there's no longer a risk. Then those stories which exist online and will exist online forever, there should be a system by which at that point the fixer can claim and receive a byline or a joint reporting credit for those stories. These things are not fixed in time. They are fungible over a period of time, and I think that's something that's, again, worth creating a set of rules. It should not be left to individuals and organizations to decide on a piecemeal basis. There should be a set of principles, protocols, guidelines, whatever the right word is.
Yeah, I think also, even if it has to be done anonymously at the time, there can still be recognition without being given a name. I.e., you can put at the bottom of a report, this reporting was done with the contribution of a local coordinator or whatever, without giving them a name, because at least there is a recognition then that story wouldn't have been possible. I mean, as a freelancer, when you get funding, I've had funding from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and part of the deal is that they have to get credit at the end of that report when it's published. And I think the same should be done for those who are working on the ground. I wouldn't be able to do any of the work that I've done in Yemen, particularly over the course of the war over the last 3 years now, without the help of those people on the ground. Most of them I can't name, and primarily because I want to be able to keep working with them as well. But I still feel that there should be a recognition at the end of every report that I'm doing that says that I've done that with the help of other people, even if I can't put their name on the end of it. Equally so, even last week I was in New York. I went to pick up the George Polk Award that I got for foreign reporting. I stood there on the stage on my own, yet there was a team of at least 2 families and 7 individuals in Yemen that I wouldn't have been able to do that reporting with without their assistance. Yet when it comes to those kind of awards, unless you stand up and say something, when you're there collecting it, they don't get any recognition for it all, other than me, thanking them via WhatsApp on the day, which isn't really enough. So yes, I think because people they're so instrumental in the work that we can produce, that we do absolutely have an obligation to recognize that.
Okay, Rajesh. trying to understand the fixer perspective, what are the key challenges that you face? Maybe security or government? What are the key challenges that you face as a fixer?
So as a fixer, see, it is always a challenge. Whenever a new story comes to us, like they come up with an synopsis. Maybe if it is a documentary or a news channel, they come up with a synopsis. And according to the synopsis and the schedule, I need to fix up everything. So there are very little time for that. So basically, they look out for the stories, for their travel purpose, their hotel purpose, everything is there in that. So again, the challenges is that without getting a permission, it is very difficult to go somewhere and shoot all those stuff. So to getting a permission is not easy, especially in India. So some places it is like very difficult, and to get the permission, you need time, like 15 days, 1 month or something like that. And this, whenever this crew come, they don't have much time. They have a limited schedule time, and we have to do all this thing. So that is the challenges what I face.
Securing permission.
Securing permission, all those stuff.
Has there ever been any instance where you've been monitored, where you've been asked not to do the work that you do working with international journalists or presenting the story on an international platform? Has it ever happened with you?
Yeah, it's happened in once I was shooting at the brothels. So fixing up those things, it took me like 4 months to get into the brothel and speak to these people. So the entire documentary was on human trafficking. So getting into that, getting into the brothel and speaking to these people, it took at least 4 months for me to talk to these people and make them understand what exactly we are doing and what they are shooting.
Okay. Ms. Craig, now I wanted to ask you regarding how do you find the right fixers? Because there are so many fixers, and then we don't have a database, we don't have a union. I mean, there's no, like, is it a very peer review system? Like, you know, I trust you, you trust someone, so I trust like, eventually that person. So how does it go about when you find a fixer?
For me, it's always been done by word of mouth, really. Often people will use local journalists. When I was first in Yemen, I was working for a local English language newspaper anyway, and that's how it kind of started. And then it's all by word of mouth after that, particularly when you're moving around the country and looking for other individuals. At the start of the war in Yemen, Ammar, the guy who I started working with in Aden, I'd never met him before, and the person that I normally work with in Aden was too afraid to work with me once the war started and just recommended him. He'd never worked with international media before. He was a doctor, which turned out to be very handy because we spent a lot of our time going through all the hospitals during the siege in Aden, and obviously he had very good access. He was also heading up some of the relief operations that were happening there when the UN agencies had left, and was responsible for handing out all the medical aid that was coming in by sea. So he turned out to be very good at his job. But at the beginning, it was really, and that's another responsibility we have, I had to sit down and explain to him kind of what the role was that I was expecting, if you like, and also when it came to interviewing people, the kind of ethics behind that and my own kind of journalistic code in the way you're asking questions, you know, to avoid putting words into people's mouths, and the whole idea of, although objectivity is a bit of a myth in my mind, but doing that is in the best way possible to achieve that. Because I think if you don't sit down and explain that to people, you can't assume if they haven't had that experience before of working with journalists that they automatically know what's expected of them. But yes, it's normally done by word of mouth, and he's now worked with other journalists as well. But he even says now, I don't know what a fixer is. I don't know what that even means. Other than what he's learned is he's kind of gone along, if you like, and building up contacts so that he can then set up interviews for people and do all that kind of thing. So a lot of fixers do kind of fall into that kind of work because they're good English speakers in those kind of scenarios, and they might they're well connected in the place where they are, but they have no background in journalism at all, and so we then have a responsibility to make sure they know what our own kind of code of conduct is as well, so that everybody's kind of happy at the end of it. And equally to make sure that I think a lot of them feel that they're treated very badly a lot of the time by the media, and that you have a working relationship with your local coordinators the same as you would do with any other colleague that you're working with. I think a lot of them find themselves quite demeaned and not either well looked after or well treated a lot of the time, and that's often a complaint you hear from people that have worked with international media organizations who are extremely demanding, have very little understanding of the pressures some people are working under locally, and the consequences for their family and all that kind of thing. So it has to be a kind of a very, understanding relationship, and a lot of it is based obviously on communication, but yes, I think we have to be more understanding, again, as Bobby mentioned at the beginning, about the long-term consequences for them as well once we've up sticks and left, what they're having to deal with afterwards, because that can often go on for a long, long time. And also make that clear to them from the beginning if they haven't had that kind of experience before, because they might not be aware of the reach that your reporting has, and that's often the case. And therefore the consequences for them from helping you. And you always have to I always give people an option. You don't have to do this. If you don't want to help me because these are the consequences, then we don't have to work together. It's not putting undue pressure on people as well is quite an issue.
From democracies to authoritarian regimes, we have fixers all over the world doing different kinds of job. But yesterday, something you said, Bobby, stuck out, that they live a lie, basically to keep their families safe, friends safe and all. So could you share some anecdotes about some of the fixers you worked with and the lengths they went to protect their families and themselves in the long run?
Yeah, I think all of us who've ever worked in difficult places have stories like this of local fixers taking enormous risks and displaying extraordinary bravery. I've got dozens of these stories. The one that I'll sort of bring up right now is the case of Ali Shaheen, who was our chief fixer translator in Baghdad. And Ali, before the war, had been he had a chicken farm, and he sold eggs for a living. And after the war, the farm was destroyed. He came to work for Time because he spoke very good English. And he learned, as you said, he learned how to be a fixer translator while he was on the job. But he knew instinctively that he was taking on a risk. In the early days after the war, it was not clear that he was doing a risky thing, but he just had an instinct that it was risky. So in his neighborhood, he just kept up the pretense that he was still going to his farm. So he'd come to the office at 6:30 in the morning, and I'd say, Ali, what are you doing here this early? And he said, if I have to keep up this pretense that I'm going to the farm, I have to leave the house at the time that I used to leave when I went to the farm. And he would leave the house at 5:30 in the morning because the farm was a couple of hours away. He would still keep up that pretense. Every now and again, he would go and buy eggs in the market and then take them to his home and distribute them among his neighbors, as if he was bringing eggs from his farm, because that was something he used to do when he had a farm. He lived that lie, if you like, except for a very few people of his closed family. Nobody knew that Ali was working for a foreign company, never mind Time magazine. 3.5 years he kept up this fiction. And then one day his wife went to buy vegetables from the local vegetable vendor down the street. And the vegetable vendor said, is it true that your husband works for an American company? And she said, no, why? Who told you that? And he said, well, there are a couple of people came up in a car yesterday. They were asking about you. They said your husband works for a foreign company. They said they wanted to know what time he leaves and goes to work. They wanted to know about your children, what time they go to school, which school they go to, how do they go to school. And obviously Ali's wife knew that the jig was up, and she was terrified. And she called Ali in the office. And Ali took the call in front of me. He spoke to her briefly, and then he told me I have to go. He didn't tell me what it was about. He drove straight to the children's school, picked them up, drove home, picked up his wife, drove them straight to the airport, put them on a plane to Jordan, locked the door of his house. This was in 2006, towards the end of 2006. It is now 2018. His family have never returned to Iraq. Ali went back and forth for many years. He never returned to his house for 2 more years after that. He would sleep on the couch in the office because he just couldn't take a risk that somebody might attack him. 2 years later, when he went back home, the house was this sort of amazing still life. I went with him. It was this life interrupted. There were still clothes in the washing machine. There were plates on the dining table. The beds were not made. They didn't even have time to pack enough clothes. And so those are the kinds of risks that people who worked with us in Iraq took. Ali no longer works for Time magazine. We shut down the bureau in 2008 or 2009. Hardest thing I ever had to do. But his life was forever changed and will forever be imperiled because he used to work with us at one time. There are groups in Iraq that will, if they know you used to work for the foreigners, do you harm. When we shut down the bureau, Time magazine, as I said, did the right thing, gave all the staff their very, very generous packages, but okay, is that the end of it? Do we no longer have any responsibility for Ali? Can we pretend that this is just like a normal employer-employee relationship where once the terms of the contract have ended, there is no further responsibility? I don't think so. I know as an individual that I owe Ali and will for the rest of my life. There are, like I said, dozens of stories like this, but that's just one.
Okay. So when I listen to your story about Ali, the scale of sacrifice done by a lot of fixers is very high, sometimes leaving the country, sometimes leaving the family behind and stuff like that. So, I mean, could you shared a very beautiful story with me yesterday about one of your colleagues had to move out of the country and stuff. Would you want to talk about it?
I feel like, I'm sure you have better stories than this one. I don't want to, I'll come back to it if you like, but maybe
I thankfully have never been in the situation where somebody has had to leave the country because of working with me. But I'm well aware that not working for a major media organization that I can't provide that kind of backup. And I was particularly aware of that in Aden at the beginning of the conflict when I was there during the siege, shortly after, and that was in May 2015, that the guy that I was working with, I was even smuggling myself in and out of his house and in niqab, just because at that point it wasn't clear. It looked like the Houthis were going to take the entire city, and if that happened, it was going to become immediately clear or very easy for them to find out who was working with the foreign journalist. For that reason, I didn't do any of my reporting until I'd left the country. But even moving in his neighborhood, I was wearing niqab all the time, and he referred to me as the old woman to all his neighbors, as if I was like an old aunt that just come to visit for a few weeks. And actually, we've kept that up. So even now when I go back, for various security reasons for both himself and for me, actually, it's worked out as the best way to kind of operate. But I was acutely aware that if something happened, that because of the visa situation, particularly for Yemenis, trying to get him out of the country was going to be incredibly difficult. And actually, I say my way around it, it wasn't a way around it, but because after I'd been working for him for a while and he was extremely good at helping me, I then recommended him to Human Rights Watch, and he has since been working for them as a researcher. But again, he's been doing obviously very controversial work, research for them that is, there are belligerents within the war, in the territory where he lives, that makes that incredibly risky. So he doesn't get any recognition for any of that either, for his own security, but also even through working for Human Rights Watch, there is no system set up to evacuate him to get out of the country because of the logistics of the visa situation of trying to get Yemenis out. Even if he did manage to get a visa to get to Jordan, for example, that would run out every month. And so, yes, as a result of that, he doesn't get any recognition for anybody doing what he does, and yet he is taking a huge amount of risk in doing all of that. So there may be a situation, there very well be in the future where, like the story that Bobby's just told, that he will have to leave the country and that he would have to leave all of his family. He, although he's not married, doesn't have children, he's got 3 brothers. He is the only now money earner in his family, so he's providing for all of both his parents really and his brothers. And so if he did have to leave the country, that would also have repercussions on them as well and how they're living. So he lives on a knife edge, if you like, and has taken a huge amount of risk to do work that obviously that he believes in very strongly. But there are very few support mechanisms there, even though he's working with a known international organization. Their options are also very limited of how they can help him.
Okay. So now this question is for all 3 of you. This is related to training that fixers receive, because a lot of them are not journalists. They come like doctors, drivers, and stuff like that. So should news organizations have a training module where they could teach them the basics of journalism, ethics, biases, filtering biases? Yeah, maybe something like that.
Maybe I think it will be great if the fixers would get an opportunity to get a training on this entire subject.
Okay, training in like what?
Training in reporting, like photojournalism, stuff like that.
Okay.
I don't want to be a stuck record on this, but the thing that we're talking about, creating these principles or protocols, we can do this online. You can create a system of tutorials where anybody working as a fixer understands their rights and understands what it is that media organizations look for from a fixer. These can be done video, they can be done for photojournalists as well, but there can be video modules teaching in multiple languages, teaching local fixers what is needed from them, what they can expect from their from their employers, what risks that they are incurring. Sometimes they don't understand fully the risks, what risks they are incurring, what steps they should take to minimize the risk. Giving them useful advice. I think you can create these resources. An organization like IJF can create resources like that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's also, on the training side of it, it's then knowing, people on the ground knowing what's expected of them a lot of the time, because I think we're, as journalists, not always clear. We make assumptions that people understand what we're trying to achieve, and without that kind of, I think having that outlined and whether it's through training or like a code of conduct, people will have a better understanding of what is expected of them. Some kind of basic journalistic ethics as well, of how journalism works. I think, we tend to make a lot of assumptions that people know all of this, particularly people that haven't had experience of working with media before, and people don't. There isn't, this automatic sort of understanding of how the media kind of system works, if you like, or what is expected of people. And I think a lot of the time, because everything is done in a huge rush a lot of the time on the ground, you go in, you might only be there for a few days for some media organizations, and you're pushing people all the time to sort of get access to stories and things like that without having beforehand sat down with somebody and kind of clearly explained, A, what you're trying to achieve, but B, how you operate, and what your kind of ethics are, what your safety system is, all of those kind of things. Very, very much people will go charging and expect somebody on the ground to do all the work for them without actually having that kind of clear, calm conversation beforehand, and giving that person the opportunity to ask questions about what is expected of them. We're often just, those kind of line of communication very rarely exist, and that's where you often have the breakdown in the field then when people, have extremely bad experiences, and it gets very antagonistic just because the real basics haven't been discussed at an earlier stage, and there's a lot of misunderstanding can happen.
Okay. It's worthwhile, actually. It cuts both ways, as you were hinting there, that there need to be some rules of engagement that reporters and photographers or video teams operating in these places need to know how they should be treating their fixers and coordinators, what they can reasonably expect and what they should not, what is unreasonable for them to ask. Most journalists who've been in the field for a couple of years learn this on the job, but we are getting into a situation where more and more you have freelancers arriving in a war zone with very little experience and are hiring somebody on the fly and are expecting them to do things that, frankly, they shouldn't expect, and they shouldn't put pressure on them to do those things. And so it would be useful, I think, to have a set of rules for reporters and for journalists going into a difficult situation for them to follow as well.
Okay. So Rajesh, I want to ask you a question. So when international journalists or news organizations come to you, do they come with a pitch saying we want so and so specifics for the story? And do you always get to see the final product? And if you don't get to, then have you ever been in a situation where you face some sort of problem because the pitch given to you was different than the final product?
So always they come with a pitch. They have their own synopsis, they have their own story. And I need to find all those things. But when it is finished, definitely I am not getting to see what is the final cut. And most of the time it has not happened. Sometime, like, I do have received some final cut, but otherwise they won't.
So has it created any problem in India, specifically with the government and everything happening right now?
No, I don't think so. It's not like that.
Okay. And with fake news taking center stage for the last 3-4 years, elections and everything, how crucial are fixers to verifying information on ground, especially in conflict zones, because there's so much war happening, different sides, so how crucial are they?
Yeah, that can be, incredibly difficult, and I think there have been previously issues where that have come up where local fixers have been under such pressure to find a particular interviewee that it's ended up being a cousin or somebody else or a friend of a friend who has taken the place of a genuine interviewee as well. I think probably the most famous case of that was the pirates in Somalia, I think. So yes, I think the journalists, the fixers obviously play an incredibly important role. Even once you're out of the country, when you're trying to back up information for your reporting that you're doing, is contacting them to verify stuff on the ground. But also, it also potentially creates can create an issue where we as journalists have to be absolutely sure about as I said before, about the issues over ethics and things like that it's very clear with fixers who are under an immense amount of pressure to avoid those kind of situations where they're trying to produce an interviewee because they're under a huge amount of pressure for something that might be slightly unrealistic, that you end up with kind of creating kind of fake news situations. But yes, I think particularly when people are working remotely outside of the country a lot of the time, we will often be using those as local sources to confirm things that are being reported in either local or international media. So even once we're out of the country, that kind of thing, a lot of the time they don't even get paid for. You'll be calling them up or contacting them by WhatsApp 3 times a week. Oh, can you confirm this? Can you find out this? Or do you remember that person we interviewed 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago? I need to contact them or whatever. All that kind of thing often happens without any additional payments as well, that we rely on people very heavily for, and they're having to make additional phone calls, et cetera, and helping us out on an almost permanent basis without any remittances for that.
Okay.
Sorry how many people here have used fixers? Show of hands. Okay. I think it might be useful to get some other perspectives.
Yeah.
Anybody want to sort of contribute to this discussion? Sure. So just.
My name is Courtney Raj. I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists, and you're mentioning a lot about the codes, the need for guidelines, et cetera. And I wonder if you've heard of a culture of safety alliance and the freelance safety principles.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So if I can just mention them quickly,
she did.
It's okay. It's all right. We need to be repeating it. It's okay.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
Anybody else?
Actually, I think we can probably hear you. This is a sort of lovely room for acoustics. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Mirjana Tomic. I work for Forum Journalismus in Medien in Wien. It's an organization in Vienna dealing with training of journalists, and I organize courses for journalists on foreign affairs. I'm a former war reporter. I have never worked in languages that I don't know. And I have several questions. I've never used a fixer. I covered the Balkan Wars and conflicts in Central America for El País. And I have following questions. While working in the Balkans, and I'm originally from there, I have seen how fixers can manipulate journalists. And they set the agenda. I would like to ask you, how do you control that? I would like to ask Project, to what extent people who come and ask you for your services know the situation on the ground? Or it is all improvised. You just said that you need 4 months for certain permits. They should know that in advance. If they don't know it in advance, it means they don't know the situation on the ground. So it means, you're probably very professional, but someone else can set the agenda. And I also do training of journalists and diplomats on how to use media for analyzing certain international political developments. And I tell all of my participants to watch out. We are never really sure in certain situations whether the journalists know the situation or it's all the work of a fixer. And you have all mentioned very important aspects, but there is the other aspect as well, and that is the aspect of users and those who use this information. Thank you.
So,
No, about international journalists coming to the country, not doing their groundwork, so they expect you to swiftly find case studies or get permissions. So how do you deal around with that?
How well prepared are they?
Yeah.
Usually when they come.
sometimes they are prepared. The thing is that if you want to take when I was working in a brothel, so if you want to take an interview inside a room or something like that, it is okay, we can do that thing. Otherwise, if you want to shoot in a brothel, in an open area, you need some sort of permission. And for that permission, and to convince the brothel people, okay, we want to shoot all this, all people are not ready at a time. Like, they won't allow us to shoot on that area because you need certain kind of permission. That there are goons and people who don't allow us to, allow you to.
Not official permissions, but permissions from the local
Yeah,
gangster.
permission from the local people. If you're not taking permission, if you're doing it in a room, if you're taking some interview with the prostitute in a room, it is okay.
Yeah.
They will allow you. But apart from that, if you want to shoot the entire brothel, they are not ready for that. So you need to convince them, and it takes a lot of time to convince them, to tell them what exactly we are doing.
Okay.
I think the issue of potential biases that come through when you're doing that kind of work, I think it is a real issue, particularly people who are dipping in and out of countries quite quickly. For me, it's something when I'm working with somebody who's new necessarily, it's being very upfront about that at the beginning, without kind of immediately distrusting people, but explaining that that may be one of your concerns. I think for me, again, because I speak enough of the local language, you can tell, very quickly when things are necessarily being manipulated in translation. Whenever I've had doubts about that, as with all journalists now, you're recording all of your, even for print journalism, any of your interviews anyway. And if I've had any doubt, is to get that independently translated. And I think with most TV crews, again, maybe not so with breaking news, I guess, is a lot of the stuff a lot of the work is translated back home independently in addition to having it done at the time. But I do think, there are serious concerns about that. And even in kind of story selection as well, of that being manipulated locally on the ground. And of course, like you say, if you've got the background of having been somewhere for a long time, you know when something's up and something's fishy and that it's not right. And I think particularly when you have got people parachuting in, yes, that is a big problem. And I think it's something that with, I mean, that's not the kind of work that I do, but I've seen it again myself, like that, how people are manipulated in order to kind of create a biased outlook, particularly when you're working in a country where there's a civil war, if you like, and there's a division, and people have got agendas. But I think that it is a very difficult thing to get around, but I think we have to explain to people very immediately when you're working with them that these are your concerns, and that if there is any doubt, you need to get everything independently translated, I think, before you're doing any kind of publication or broadcast. I don't know what other ways there are to kind of avoid that kind of a problem, and it is an issue.
Again, the word of mouth helps.
Yeah.
If fixers develop reputations from working with a bunch of journalists. So if I were to go to Yemen, return to Yemen tomorrow, I would ask Iona. And Iona would have worked with a bunch of people, and she would be able to vouch for them, and vouch for not just their language capabilities, translation capabilities, or their knowledge of the local scene and their connections, but also vouch for their credibility and whether or not they've done the kinds of things you're describing. I think that helps too. Preparation and word of mouth is basically what you rely on. I was counting yesterday when we were sitting down and chatting and preparing for this. I've worked with stringers and fixers in 15 or 16 different countries, and I can only think of one instance in that entire time when it was clear that the fixer was not being entirely honest in the situation. On the other hand, I can think of hundreds of situations where fixers have risen above themselves, above their own concerns, their own biases, their own preferences to help me do the work that I needed to do.
Would you mind describing that instance?
Yeah, it was basically this incident, interestingly, happened in Yemen, and the fixer was from northern Yemen. We had gone to the south, and we had gone to meet a very important military person, a general, and the general was speaking in Arabic. My Arabic is good enough to know the gist of a conversation, but he was using a lot of technical terms, military terms, in Arabic, which I obviously didn't get. Fortunately for me in that instance, because of the rules, we had to hire, in addition to having my fixer from Sana'a, we had to hire a local fixer as well. And even though that person didn't really have any work, we just had to have the local guy. The local guy sort of later, the following day, told me, your guy's not giving you the full picture here. The translation is, he's missing things in translation. And I thought that was an innocent, I said, is this an innocent mistake? Sometimes it'll happen with technical terms. He said, no, he's not giving you the full picture. Which set up a really interesting quandary for me, because do I confront my northern fixer and then therefore put the southern guy in difficulty, or what? Luckily I had those, as she said, I had everything recorded. I was able to check later on when I had left Yemen. For the purposes of, we now file stories every day in addition to for online and so on. I just didn't use that interview for my dispatch that day because it was potentially tainted. I didn't want to take the chance. It was only later when I was able to come back, verify some things, that I was able to use quotes from that interview. That was the one example that I know.
You believe he was pursuing an agenda?
Yeah. And subsequently, again, word of mouth turns out that, yeah, he did have an agenda.
I have a question. So do you also discuss political ideologies with fixers you work with? Because it's good to know, what are their affiliations or whatsoever.
I think I usually do. It's just a human interaction. If you're particularly in a place where there is great crisis, they want to tell you where they stand quite often. And you want to know where they stand. What do you think?
Yeah, you do. But again, I think going back to what Bobby said, I actually found that the people that I've worked with, although they have their own inbuilt biases, particularly when you're working in a conflict situation within a country, they do right above that. They understand that. And you, as long as you've had that conversation with them as well, you know what their own alliances or perspective is, but they understand that aspect of journalism of trying to reach the kind of objectivity kind of aspect that doesn't, that can never really be reached in perfection. But they understand the process of that and are very good actually at rising above that, their own kind of inbuilt biases, if you like. But I think you do have to be clear with people about that. But generally speaking, I've never had a real issue in people trying to bend the kind of story to meet their own end. Probably because, going back to this question, I've worked in the country for a long time, so I know from the outset, as and when if somebody is trying to manipulate you in that way. But yeah, I think it's all about communication a lot of the time.
So at this point, I'd also like to show an interview we did with journalist Deborah Campbell. Miss Campbell in early 2000 went to Syria. She met an Iraqi fixer who had to flee Iraq because of US invasion of Iraq and stuff like that. So this woman, Ahlam, gave access to a lot of international organizations and journalists to report from her community on the problems they face. And what eventually happened was the Syrian security agencies got to her, incarcerated her for 10 months, and they asked her to spy on international journalists. So when Ahlam disappeared, Campbell went back to Syria, tried tracking her down. She was very worried about what happened with her. So we've done a short video, we've done a small interview, so I'd like all of you to see that.
The disappearance in Damascus is the story of my friendship with my fixer, a remarkable Iraqi woman named Ahlam. I first met her in 2007 when I was a freelancer reporting a story for Harper's Magazine on the Iraqi refugees who were flooding across the border. She was well-connected, a pillar of her community, and kind of like a one-woman NGO. Because she had these extensive contacts and because people trusted her, she was an excellent fixer. She worked for everybody. She worked for BBC, Al Jazeera, Reuters, NPR, also Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, UNHCR. We became good friends, and a year later, I was back in Damascus after the story ran, and she was arrested in front of me by Syria's secret police. The book is about my search for her. One of the reasons I wrote the book was to bring attention to the life of a fixer. It's one of those jobs that nobody's heard of, and yet fixers are responsible for bringing us most of the news from the world's most dangerous places. Most foreign correspondents have used a fixer in some way, whether as a driver or translator or guide, or to help them make contacts. I'd previously avoided using fixers. In my work, it's more like immersive journalism than daily news. I tend to spend long periods of time in the societies I'm writing about, so I work through friends, whether, for example, an archaeologist, university students. Once in Iran, my fixer, unofficially, was a poet. Or I've worked through local journalists. One of the reasons that I've been a little bit reluctant to use fixers is because a lot of fixers are forced to register with their governments. They need permission from authorities to operate, and often in return for that, they may be under pressure to spy on you. Because of the way Ahlam worked, she was unofficial. She wasn't registered with Syria's Ministry of Information like most Syrian fixers were compelled to be, and I came to really trust her. But she was being spied on. And when she was arrested, the Syrian secret police tried to turn her into an informant to spy on us, on journalists. She refused, and for that reason they kept her locked up. When freelance journalists or fixers run into trouble, we're sort of in the same boat. There's no one we can call upon to help. And the difference between a fixer and a freelance journalist is generally that the journalist has a passport that can serve as some kind of protection. The worst thing that can happen to us in most cases is that we're deported. We have to go home. For fixers like Ahlam, that's not an option. If she was deported to somewhere like Iraq, her home country, that could be a death sentence for her. So she was stuck. What helped Ahlam in the long run was that she had so many connected friends, journalists like myself and others, and NGOs who lobbied for her release. And not everyone has that. But it's my belief that that advocacy is the reason that she was eventually released and flown to Chicago by the UNHCR. We've remained friends. I see her regularly. And right now we're both consultants on the film that's being developed by Terry George, who made Hotel Rwanda. So what can we do to protect fixers? Well, first of all, I think coming to acknowledge the key role that fixers play in bringing us world news. Fixers do invisible work, so we don't tend to see them. They're behind the scenes, and many want it that way. It's a risky job, and they may not want their names known. But if news agencies, if media outlets accepted a sense of responsibility and created a policy to advocate for fixers who are endangered because of their work, that would be a good start. Secondly, reporters can acknowledge that they have a responsibility not to put their fixers at unnecessary risk. That's not easy to do, but it starts with awareness. So finally, the main thing I think we can do right now is to start talking about it, to start acknowledging the importance of fixers and our moral responsibility, whether as reporters or as media outlets, to take steps to protect fixers when they get into harm's way, so that they don't end up in the situation Ahlam did, or worse.
Based in Egypt until very recently. The question I wanted to ask was, when I first started working as a Middle East reporter, I wasn't really given that much training. Hostile environment training came actually after I'd been engaged in several conflict zones. In that hostile environment training, I realized that there was never any discussions about how we should look after fixers. And is there any way of that being introduced? Because, I mean, these companies put us through hostile environment training basically because of insurance, but shouldn't that be part of it? Because I mean, just from a selfish perspective of these organizations, they have to deal with the death of a fixer. The other point is it's slightly different from fixers, but there's a sort of pattern in international journalism where you have usually a white correspondent who doesn't speak the language of the country that they are being posted to, going there and working with a local news assistant who does all the reporting on the ground and doesn't, maybe gets a second byline or anything. I mean, is there any way of being able to have a kind of paradigm shift in the way that we treat not just fixers, but our news assistants? Because I don't think the readership, I mean, the readers are not realizing that the majority of this work is coming off the back of not the white correspondent whose name is first on the byline.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what Bobby was saying right at the beginning, and we kind of discussed at length yesterday evening, is that there needs to be a way that the media organizations do acknowledge fixers, whether it's a kind of additional reporting line for print journalism. I think in broadcast media, there is a tendency to do that more anyway, because you get credit, particularly for documentary filmmaking and things like that, where at least people will be acknowledged and given a credit. I think in the print media, we're particularly bad about doing that. The Wire's a bit better. They will at least acknowledge and give names to people at the bottom reporting anybody that's contributed to that. But yes, I do, as Bobby said, we need to have an overall kind of code of conduct, really, how we all operate in giving fixers both recognition and a system of safety. And going back to the safety issue, as I said earlier, in 8 years, I've had one media organization when I've been working as a freelancer who's asked about providing insurance coverage for a fixer. What I've done personally is I take an extra medical kit that the fixer can use, and I train them how to use it. That's really important. You know, we've all done the hostile environment training. It's not much good if you're the one that gets injured and they can't help you because they don't have the equipment or whatever else, and vice versa. So yes, I've always taken you know, one of my smaller pouches of, and I normally leave that with them, so they have it all the time. And train them, you know, the basics of how to use a tourniquet and all those kind of things, because that doesn't happen otherwise. It should happen. I think particularly when media outlets are using somebody, you know, very regularly, that they need to have some kind of basic training in you know, in first aid and that kind of thing. But, you know, as we were saying earlier, the wheels are moving slowly in the sense of that movement has happened really now for freelancers and is getting considerably better, but we do need to kickstart something to make sure fixers get the same as freelancers do now, and that we do have a kind of code of conduct and a way of looking after people better than we're doing right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've been saying from the beginning, let's make the rules, let's create just a show of hands. Principles or protocols, which sounds better? Principles or protocols? Principles. So principles. Let's do this, folks. Let's set up the Perugia principles, and let's first put our heads together, come up with a set of these rules and resources that we can make available digitally and otherwise, and then sort of put pressure on news organizations to sign up. It's been done for freelancers. The Committee to Protect Journalists has done great work there. Why not for fixers? I don't see why not.
Any last questions?
Hi, my name's Lawrence. I'm a freelance journalist, and I've done a lot of what I would probably characterize as community journalism or participatory journalism in places like Sierra Leone, Nigeria. And I just wanted to get your reflections a bit more, perhaps, on, you know, in line with these principles, how we could perhaps formalize the idea of skills transfer, because one thing that I think, and it's really good that we're talking about this openly, about sort of troublesome definition of a fixer. You know, one of the things that I found to be incredibly rewarding is investing in the skills that I can offer, just as much as a local fixer is investing in what they can provide for me in a story that we're working on in unison. And I just, felt like that sort of skills transfer is something that is quite an important thing to reflect on. I don't know whether or not any of you have any sort of insight into that, specific examples, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tendency, at least I've had, I shouldn't generalize, I've had the tendency to assume that if someone's working for me as a fixer, that they want to acquire the skills of a journalist, that they want to become a journalist eventually. And that's sometimes the case, in fact, I would say often the case, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they don't want to become a journalist. They're fine doing, they set the definitions of what they want to do and what skills they want from you. I've done things like, I have said, look, you know, obviously I can help them improve their English, I can help them improve their writing skills. There have been a couple of occasions where I have offered to, and for a little time, provided English lessons to their children. So I think, and some of that is just human interaction, right? You're working with somebody closely in an incredibly difficult place, in a difficult situation. That's not a normal working relation. That goes deeper. You'll know this from your own experience. You've been in the trenches together, not to be melodramatic, but you've been in the trenches together. You're more than just colleagues, and therefore you're invested in each other in a more meaningful way, I find. And so it's just a human thing. I want to help, and how can I help beyond just pay you your fee? But I have to sometimes check myself and remind myself that they should decide what help they want from me rather than my imposing on them.
Yeah, I think certainly when I've worked with local journalists as well, again, it's kind of, a human interaction really, but it's helping them out as well to get work published internationally. I've done that quite a lot with English-speaking journalists in Yemen. Again, I've done, 2 or 3 workshops now in Yemen as well to help out local journalists. Sometimes that's been on safety, on investigative journalism, and equally that's a two-way thing as well, because they obviously have far more experience in working locally about, the limits that they can push to, and their experiences on the ground. Their knowledge is far greater than yours is, so it works both ways. But yes, I think we're not very good at that as well, actually, is building on that kind of transfer of skills, as you mentioned, which could be beneficial to both sides, really.
I'd be curious to hear from Rajesh. When you work with these foreign crews, are there any skills that you want from them, that you want them to teach you to help you get?
Certainly. I want to get into photojournalism. I want to know the ethics, the rules, how it works.
Do you find them cooperative? Do they help you?
Yeah. Most of the time, but still, I do want to learn more doing photojournalism.
Thank you, Ayana, Bobby, and Rajesh for the insightful session, and thank you all for being here. I think it's time to wrap. The next session starts in a few minutes.
for joining us. My name is Cristina Kim, and I am the Engagement and Collaborations Manager for the Center for Investigative Reporting.
And I'm Christa Scharfenberg. I'm the acting CEO of the Center for Investigative Reporting.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization and then share with you how we have really transformed our newsroom into being kind of driven by impact and hopefully smarter about how we think about it and how we track it. And then we're going to show you some examples of stories we've done where we've tracked the impact, had a lot of impact and tracked it and really used it to inform reporting that's come afterwards, and show you a tool that we've built that we're here to share with other newsrooms as well. So the Center for Investigative Reporting, I'm going to call it CIR for shorthand because it's a long name. CIR was founded 41 years ago. We're in the San Francisco Bay Area in the United States. We're a nonprofit investigative newsroom. We have about 70 people on staff now. We're multi-platform, so we do sort of deep dive text, print investigations. We have a public radio show called Reveal that's on close to 500 stations across the United States now. It's 1 hour of investigative reporting every week. We also do documentary film production, a lot of data-driven reporting, interactive data apps online. So we work kind of in every medium. We cover a wide variety of topics, so environmental reporting, criminal justice, money and politics.
Anything to hold people accountable.
Yes.
Can't do anything wrong.
And we really sort of thrive on creativity. We think a lot about how to tell our stories to reach wide audiences. We experiment frequently. We do a lot of collaborations with artists and local news organizations and community groups to really try to tell these stories that can be very dense and long, but to tell them in a way that get to the people most affected by them and really reach new audiences. So that's what we're all about. We are nonprofit, so we're funded largely by big foundations, smaller family foundations, individual donors, and we've just launched a membership program recently to get smaller dollar donations from people, which kind of factors into the impact work. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So I got into journalism, it was a little roundabout, but my father was a journalist in Boston in the US, and growing up, I saw how he and his colleagues really affected daily life in the city. He worked at the Boston Globe, and at that time the newspaper was really kind of the moral voice in the city, and I saw how they were able to kind of shape issues and really make a difference. And I ended up at CIR not because I sort of set out to get into journalism, but my friend was running it at the time, and I needed a good job a long time ago. And I got there, and I just realized, like, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be, and this work really, it really does make a difference. The issues that we're reporting on changed. The organization was very small when I got there, and now it's much bigger. But the kind of through line the whole time was really having an impact. When I got to CIR until recently, the way we thought about it was, each person kind of defined impact on their own. Each reporter tracked the impact of their stories on their own. We weren't sharing that information across the organization in any sort of coherent way. And I'm not sure for around the world, but certainly in the United States, the funders who are funding journalism care deeply about the impact of the work. And that kind of pushed us to think about how do we define our impact? How do we measure our impact? How do we talk about the impact that we're having? So I think about 4 years ago, we brought on a researcher. She had a fellowship to work with us for 2 years. And that was her whole job, was to think about how do you define journalism impact, and how can this organization sort of lead the way in thinking about it and measuring it and sharing that with other newsrooms. around the country and around the world. And so she sort of built a framework for us, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and then this tool that we'll show you too to make it, very simple for every reporter, every editor, everyone in the organization to sort of keep up to date on what's happening as a result of the reporting that we do. Do you want to?
Yeah. Oh, here we are. And can I control it? I can't. So I'll just go like this to make it move. I can?
Not moving.
Bueno. While we figure that out, we'll talk about, our mission for the Center for Investigative Reporting, which I think Christa was getting at, and I'll just read it to you, is the Center for Investigative Reporting seeks to engage and empower the public through investigative journalism and groundbreaking storytelling in order to spark action, improve lives, and really generate impact. And so impact is a huge word. It just means a change in the status quo as a result of a direct intervention. In journalism, that can take the form of a story, a radio documentary, a video documentary, an event series, whatever the case may be. But that's a very large umbrella. That just essentially means change, and when you define it in such a broad way, it's almost impossible to track in a real, granular, and nuanced way. So Lindsay Green Barber did this amazing thing where she broke it down. She created an impact framework. And the way she broke it down was into 3 levels of impact. The largest one being macro, which obviously as investigative reporters means laws are being changed. There's a real shift. A policy is introduced, so something very large. And often in the past when we've talked about impact, we only think about macro impacts, which is great, but we're missing so much. And so that's when the other levels are really helpful. So the second level is the meso level. This is the community level. So are people talking about it? Is there, tweet storms happening around it? Is a public official talking about it in a community meeting? That's already in this middle ground that sometimes we just think it's, oh, that's a really great outcome from our reporting, but we don't track it. And the last one is micro, so the individual level. Did you get an email from someone who read your story, and as a result of the story that you published and wrote, they are now more active in their community, or they change their viewpoints? So thinking about those 3 levels allows us to understand the ways that outcomes and change actually happen. Because what we've seen over time is that when we're tracking the micro, the meso, and the macro, we see how they're all linked together. There is no macro change without micro change, and as journalists, we can often forget that. And so something that Lindsay Green Barber really helped us understand is that we need to track all of these levels in order to have a real understanding of what our work is doing for the world and our local communities. And we're gonna I'm sorry that we don't have a slideshow that we prepared for you, but
let's do this after when we get into the tracker.
Okay.
We can go back to this because it's a little hard to explain.
Sure.
So the reasons for us for tracking impact, which we hope kind of makes sense for all of you too. First is, as Cristina was saying, is to really understand the real changes sparked by your work. And when we show you some examples of our projects, if we hadn't been tracking kind of these micro, meso, macro changes over time, we wouldn't have realized that our reporting was leading to these outcomes sometimes a year or 2 later. So it's really getting a deeper understanding of how your reporting is contributing to change that's happening. We work really hard to use the data that comes out of this tool we have to inform future reporting. So it's not the only thing we use to decide what stories to do, but as we understand better which stories are having an impact, it helps us choose. If a reporter is thinking about 2 or 3 projects, really being able to think about, well, which one of these has the most likelihood for really mattering to people and making a difference in the end, we'll theoretically go with that one. And we found it's really helped us to build trust with our audiences. I mean, as you know, there's so much information out there. People don't sort of know where to go, for a trusted news source. And so if for us as an investigative newsroom, the projects we do can take 6 months, a year, 2 years to happen, but we follow the impact of those stories. We try to stay on them over time. And we found that really helps the audiences sort of trust us. We're not just dumping a big project on them and then moving on to the next thing. They feel like we're staying with these stories over time. And then for us, it's a huge tool for our fundraising. How many of you are from nonprofit newsrooms? A few people. It is the centerpiece for how we raise money from big foundations, from individual donors, is being able to talk about, the why that we do this work. It's not just telling the story. It actually makes a difference in the world. So we're going to talk about a few projects, walk you through a few projects and how we've sort of built impact into them and then used our learnings to inform the next story we've done.
Great, so I'm going to talk to you about one of our case studies. It was a reporting project called The Dark Side of the Strawberry. It was published in November of 2014 by Bernice Young, Kendall Taggart, and Andy Donahue. And what they found is that in California, in Salinas and Oxnard, California, which is where a lot of our agriculture, especially strawberry production is, what was happening is that they were using pesticides that are called fumigants. Fumigants are poisonous gases that were actually developed for warfare during Vietnam, but have been found useful by farmers by injecting them into the soil, which then allows for greater and larger strawberry production, which is like a multi-million-dollar industry for California. Of course, these gases release out. They don't just stay in the soil, and unfortunately what we found is that there's a loophole in the law that's allowing the levels of these fumigants to be far higher than they should be by law, and they're particularly impacting these, obviously, agricultural communities. What you're seeing here is Oxnard, California. This is Rio Mesa High School. You can see that it's surrounded by strawberry fields, and what we did through our investigation was found that they were at 20 times the level that they were supposed to be. But nobody knew about it, and the community really didn't understand that fumigants were even being used and what the health repercussions were of that use. So before we even launched our investigation, we actually partnered with USC, the University of Southern California, and we surveyed people who lived in these communities and tried to understand what their level of understanding or know-how was of the fumigants that were being used. And most people really didn't know that what was being used at all or even about this loophole law. So we did that, and as we developed our investigation, we met people. We partnered with The Guardian, which was our national partner in order to get the story out there. But we also did some local work. What you see here is Jenna Welch. She's our director of StoryWorks, and what she did was work with the high school students of that high school, told them the information that the reporters were learning, and then worked with them almost in Teatro Campesino. Is everyone kind of familiar with that? So Teatro Campesino during the UFW strikes with Cesar Chavez was a way that Chicanos in Central Valley were spreading information and news, and they did it through theater, through reproducing the story through play acting. So really using that model, we worked with the high school students to play act the news in order for it to be theirs and to really understand it. And the teachers union actually got very involved as a result and became one of the biggest advocates in the community for really holding the government accountable to making sure that these fumigants weren't used. So this was one of our engagement strategies, and the idea behind it is like, go where people are. The news should be accessible, and if it's not understandable by the communities that are impacted by it, then what's the use for it? The second thing we did was partner with the Ventura County Star. So we had been resting on our laurels a little bit, and we thought we partnered with The Guardian. We're good. This is going to get everywhere. Impact's just going to roll down. That wasn't what we learned from tracking it. It was actually the Ventura County Star that, when we did the survey again, 32% of the people we surveyed found out not through The Guardian, but through actually the local paper. And so that was an insight that we've really taken since 2014 onward, that you need to do creative engagement, such as play acting, and you need to really partner with local community newspapers in order to actually make sure that your information is reaching those that are most impacted. And I just have to talk about this. So that was in 2014. So because we were tracking the micro, the macro, and the meso, and all the outcomes that have been happening as a result of that story, we continue tracking it years later. So that the law that was allowing for the fumigant use finally got off the books. Like, now they actually have stricter laws, and that got passed in November of 2017. So that's 2 years after we first even published this piece, and so I think tracking impact is really important, because sometimes the work that you're doing has a much longer tail. And you know, the newsroom cycle, you forget about it, you're on to the next one. But you really need to be tracking it because your work is really changing the world. But if you're not looking for it, you won't even remember to like understand that. All right, and then this is our most recent investigation. So some of the insights we're still kind of learning from, but what we did was apply what we learned in strawberries to Kept Out. So Kept Out is just published this year. Our reporters, Aaron Glantz and Emmanuel Martinez, looked at over 31 million records from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act records. And what they found is that in 61 metro areas in the United States, there's evidence of modern-day redlining. What that means is that African Americans, Latinos, and in some places Asian Americans and Native Americans are actually not being given conventional home loans. So they're just being closed out of the conventional home mortgage market, making it them unable to buy homes. So we knew that this story is obviously a national one, but we also knew that it's a deeply personal one, because what we did was we were able to track where and in what areas this was happening. So the first thing as a national audience reader you're going to want to know is it happening in my neighborhood? Is it happening where I grew up? So we worked and created this interactive map where you can type in your address and find out the likelihood of you being denied if you're Black, Latino, Asian, or Native American. So this was an interactive way, more digital strategy for getting people the news personalized for them. And we also have something called Amplify, where people can actually text in their address and get a bunch of information about their particular neighborhood, as well as like the national findings we had found in our methodology. And finally, taking some of the lessons that we had learned from strawberries and recognizing like this is a national story and we're telling the national story. We distributed it on our radio program through AP, which is the Associated Press of the United States, so all over. And we even had it on the television on NewsHour. But we were telling, you know, the national story, and we had focused in on Philadelphia because we had partnered with WHYY, which is the public radio station of Philadelphia. However, we wanted to make sure that this data was available for everyone. So what you're seeing here, that's actually Emmanuel Martinez, who was the data reporter who did all the digging, explaining both to local journalists, both radio and press, as well as housing advocates, about how to actually use this information for their own reporting, but also for their own work. So again, really thinking about a local strategy and making sure that, you know, all the work we're doing is really reaching the communities most impacted.
So the big takeaways that we've had from doing this work our first, as Cristina was saying, is partnering with local news organizations, and that's really where we find we have real-world impact. So if you're a national or regional news organization, building those local partnerships and getting the reporting to the people most affected really makes a difference. If you are a local news organization, then you've got all the power right in your hands to do this work. All of the creative engagement that we do, like the plays and working with artists, and we've, like with the Strawberry story, delivering postcards to every house in the zip codes around the area that we were reporting on, really makes a difference, because then people who are affected get the information they need to go sort of push for change. And then really thinking about stakeholders, who are the people that are going to care about this story ahead of time, really helps us. So for example, the working with local journalists and housing advocates that Cristina was just talking about with the Kept Out series, we had a whole series of webinars, so pulling people together, I think 4 or 5 times, like big groups of people to share the data, show them how to use it. And doing that ahead of time led to all of this local reporting in addition to ours. So local journalists were able to take those stories, or take the data and create their own local story. And then, we find by tracking, we just have, as Cristina was saying too, we have access to information, like connecting the dots that we just wouldn't have been able to do beforehand. So we're going to show you how we connect the dots now.
Yes, so we built this thing called the Impact Tracker, which I'm going to try and connect to now, and we'll have our fingers crossed. There it is. It actually worked, and you can see it. Okay, so what is the impact tracker? So Lindsay Green Barber, she created this framework for us, but then she wanted to create an easy way for our reporters to actually track the impacts they were doing beyond their Excel sheet, and in a general database so that all teams could look at it and see the long tail of all of our work, right? It's not just one story, but all of our stories. So we created the impact tracker, which you can see here. This is our demo. And it's really easy to use. All you have to do is log in. Reporters don't need to log in with a password or anything. They can just go straight to this. They say submit outcome. And then they have to, write a description of it. So let's see. Give me a description.
Community meeting.
Community meeting held as a result of kept out. The date of the impact when it actually happens, and then what the reporter needs to do is actually track it if it's a macro, a meso, or a micro. So for us, because we're an investigative newsroom, we've really tailored the way that we define the macro, the meso, and the micro to our needs. But it's a really nimble tool, and it can work for a local newsroom, for somebody who's doing more features, for anything. But for us, we're investigative, so we've created some of these tags. So again, hearing, institutional action. So here, a community meeting was held. Let me fix that. And so that's definitely for us a meso. Let's see, content used in a public meeting. Perfect. So that's it. That's all the reporter would have to do, is describe the outcome itself, label it within one of the impact meso, macro, or micro categories. It could be a media one, which means perhaps your story was picked up by another location, mentioned and or copycatted, in which case you would maybe put that publication here as well as the link. But in order to make sure that you can actually track your work, you would select a beat. So in this instance, it would be housing for us. A subtopic would be the title of the series. So for us, it's kept out. And then tags are for anybody to use. So we like to use our reporters' names so that they can track their impact across all their stories. And I'll show you what that actually looks like beyond just this simple form. But great. And so then that's all you have to do. You reviewed it, you save it, and you've logged your impact. So what does that look like in the greater scheme? So if you wanted to see the overall impact, what you would do is you would go to the impact log, and you would render a timeline chart. And let's say we only want to look at everything from kept out. And we apply it. So that's all of our outcomes. Oh, I feel like it's not filling the whole screen, but this is all of our impact outcomes that we've had from kept out. And then if we were to render the timeline, here it is. You can see, I wish that you could see. I don't know, it's like kind of an exploded screen, so maybe if I do this. Okay. So then you can actually see, like, the story was published in, and this is for kept out. You can see that we can track what these little images are. So this is a media mention when it looks like a little newspaper. When it's like a networked tool, that's a meso impact that we logged. You can click into it, and you can actually see what it was. So this is actually for strawberries, and it says the Society's pages, a sociology blog, cites CIR investigation on strawberries, and an article about strawberry shortcake. So good impacts, guys. But what we could see and what we were able to infer from this chart, like the reason we were able to know that partnering with the Ventura County Star led to greater macro impacts is because we were able to track it on that visualizer and see that it was only after that we partnered with the Ventura Country Star that we were able to have those impacts, that it wasn't the Guardian partnership, but actually that local one. In addition to the rendering timeline, which again gives you that screen, we also have this. This is our new visualizer, which when you log into Google Analytics, will create a line that lets you see your web traffic in addition to this more visualized chart of your macro, meso, and micro and media impacts. So macro is this magenta color, meso is this orange, and then micro is that kind of lavender that you're seeing. And then media mentions and just kind of like overall distribution is that blue. So again, this really allows us, and I think you can speak to it, to see and actually have like editorial strategy in a way that if we weren't tracking it, we wouldn't be able to see. And I'm going to go back to this so you can actually see it a little better. So again, really easy form for journalists, editors, everyone to use so that we can get these insights. So that's actually what you'll see, and you'll see it much more clear this way. That red line, again, is web traffic and page views. And then again, we're really able to see like the spikes in terms of like audience engagement on our digital site, and then the way that our work is having impacts in the real world. So that's our, yes. And that's our tool in itself, which unfortunately is hard to do a demo live right now, and I apologize, and I'm happy to stick afterwards and actually go in the tool with you so that you can actually see the full screen. But if you are interested in just learning more and you go to this bit.ly, what that is, it will take you to a Google form so that you can start to define what micro and meso and macro impacts mean to you, and someone from our team will actually work with you to customize an impact tracker for your newsroom based on what you think and you want to track and how you define impact, again, for your newsroom. So you might want to visit that. It'll just take you to a Google form. Yes.
So one thing that maybe we should have said a little bit more explicitly at the beginning, but you know, sometimes you do a story and immediately, you know, someone the next day calls for some reform or change, and you know very clearly, like my reporting led to this happening. But other times, like with some of these stories, it really is over time, and being able to see how, you know, community members kind of getting engaged in the issue, building, you know, to community meetings, to maybe public hearings, to, you know, you can really, with the timeline, you can start to see. Because sometimes, you know, you'll see something happen years later and think, well, we were probably a part of that, but we can't really say definitively, you know, how the reporting was used. And you start to be able to connect the dots and see how the kind of interest is building over time and you know, leading to some change at the end of the timeline. So, you know, for our newsroom, the thing that has been really essential to starting to be more impact-driven in this deep way is to make sure that everybody is involved. And so, you know, the leadership team plays a strong role in telling everyone again and again, you have to use this tool, because we really rely on this information for our fundraising. The editors and reporters, obviously, are the primary people who are sort of putting in the information and tracking what's happening as a result of the stories. The audience and engagement team, which Cristina is a part of, are using this all the time to think about how can we, you know, sort of design our engagement in a more and more effective way to reach people. And then the fundraising teams, and you know, it's just essential. This information is essential for them in their work. So.
Oh, yes, apologies.
So I think whether you wanted to use our tool or a tool like this, or just want to start thinking about being more impact-driven yourself, you know, the big challenge is getting people, you know, everyone on board with thinking in this way about the work that you do. And so some of the things that we've just found help and can help you get started are really celebrating impact internally. So we try regularly, like we have a staff meeting every Monday morning for the whole organization, and we always talk about at those meetings if there's been some outcome as a result of our reporting, and you know, sending emails around to everybody so that there's, like, people get recognition when something happens as a result of their work, and you know, it feels good, I think, to be recognized, and so constantly sort of talking about it internally. Also, it's really important to assign a couple of people in the organization to really drive this. Like, somebody has to be responsible. Lindsay, who we've both mentioned, who used to work with us, when she was a full-time staff person, everybody was like on it. Since she has left, you know, we found that sometimes we'll start, just full disclosure, you know, people get a little lazier about it, and so you really need one or two people in the organization to kind of champion this and make sure whenever you hear that, you know, something has happened as a result of your reporting, saying, remember to put it in the tracker. He's like, somebody has to be a kind of nudge. And then starting small. So, you know, for all of you, thinking about, if you're not already doing this kind of, thinking about it in this way, is like pick a project or a beat and really commit to thinking about the impact ahead of time and then tracking it over time. And I think if people around you start seeing what that looks like, it helps to get more buy-in from your colleagues.
Mm-hmm. Great, so we can take some questions, but before we do, I just want to say, sometimes when we say impact-driven newsrooms, we get the question like, but you're a newsroom, you're not advocates. You have to walk a fine line. You're reporting, but you can't, be pushing for a certain outcome. And that's true. We don't do that. We are not advocates. We're an investigative newsroom, and we are just distributing content. However, I think by defining ourselves as impact-driven, it's really made us be more aware of just how we distribute our stories and how they are accessible and how news can be useful. And I think just thinking about it that way, and again, identifying who our stakeholders are and who's most impacted by our findings, has led us to become an impact-driven newsroom. Not that we're advocates, but that we're really conscientious and really thinking about how we push out our information and who we work with.
Yeah, thanks. Just a really interesting presentation. Just two quick questions. So one, if I understand correctly, you can set up an impact tracker for other organizations to use. Okay, great. And the other would be, how do you choose what and when to communicate about your impact to your readers, so online? Obviously, you probably don't write a separate article for every tweet mention. But like for, with local exchange, you probably write an article about. So what about with those micro, meso impact? How do you communicate? Do you write each month a small article about the project and what were the impacts, or what do you do?
For now, you're right. We don't write an article every time somebody tweets about our stories. That would be really boring. But we do, like with the Kept Out project on redlining, there was quickly a bunch of activity, so we waited a few weeks and then we just do blog posts. Once there's something interesting enough to say or enough things have happened that we think it would be interesting to our readers. We also, with our radio show, it's every week, so there's 52 episodes a year. About 32 or 34 are brand new original episodes. The others are repeats, but we call them impact shows. So we choose stories that we've aired previously where impact has happened, and then we update them to talk about what's happened since. And we hear from our listeners that they really, that's what I was saying about they love that we come back to these stories. Like we really do follow them over time. A lot of the work we do is terribly depressing and dark, and it's all kind of rape and murder and corruption. And I think showing people that we do these stories because they actually can help contribute to righting injustices, people really value that. As I mentioned earlier, we're developing a membership program now, so for people to give us small dollar donations, and one of the member benefits is an impact update. I think we said we would do it quarterly, but we have to actually get those on the schedule. So for people who are actually giving us money, a more formal kind of report back every couple of months about the impact.
And then at the end of the year, we also do kind of an overview, or at least we did this year, of all the impacts our stories have had, and we go back back to 2014 and really communicate it out that way as well. But also the tool is, the tool is open source, so if you go to the website, you can customize it with us, or you can just download it and play it around for yourself.
Is this now the only system you use to track your success, or do you have a more traditional dashboard with podcast subscribers as an indicator as well?
Yeah. We have both. So we have been a little behind the times in having an actual dashboard, but we're developing one now so we can see all of the platforms we work on in one place. And that's more about just audience reach and the kind of pure numbers. This tool gets a little deeper into, as you saw, a different kind of information, and so those are the two primary tools that we use.
Though this tool now integrates with Google Analytics, as you saw, or I tried to show you live, as well as it feeds into Meltwater, which is our clipping service. So it's automatically updated by all our media mentions, as well as copycat stories, et cetera, et cetera.
Second question, can you talk a bit about how you came up with those 6 or 7 categories for micro, meso, and macro? How did you?
I'm going to go back to that slide.
How did you define the ones in the drop-down menu?
Yeah. So this, when it wasn't working earlier, we were going to show you this. So these are just how we define the 3 buckets, and as Cristina said, totally customizable. So if you did this yourself, you come up with these categories. And I think it was really just the editorial team, you know, the editors, reporters, spent a lot of time thinking about it before we set it up. I believe you can change it as you go, too. Yeah. So you have to start somewhere, and then you can get more sophisticated as you're using it and realizing what's actually helpful. So yeah, I mean, I think we thought about like what typically happens, what are the kinds of things that can happen after our reporting, and started there, and then it has sort of evolved over the years. Mm-hmm. A microphone, yeah.
2 short questions. One question, did I understand well that your impact tracker is an open source tool? Yes. Oh, excellent. So you just provide help, but we actually build what we need to build. Okay. And could you lead us a bit through your micro and meso impact parameters so that we understand what you had in mind? What is first, how do you measure attitude change? How do you measure increased awareness and knowledge?
Sure. So for attitude change, that could be we get our reporters get a lot of emails, they get a lot of tweets, and sometimes it really is like, until I read your reporting, I, didn't believe in DACA, or I didn't understand, an immigrant's plight. That's an attitude change. That's all we need. We just need somebody to attach the email or the tweet. That's enough for us. In terms of increased awareness and knowledge, if you're seeing your story be tagged repeatedly on Twitter or on Facebook, or you just know that people are talking about it, that's also an increased awareness and knowledge. But you are getting at something which is true, which is when the reporter is tagging it for themselves, it is a little bit of a subjective call. But what we think is that it's better to have that in order to see the greater waves of impact, because it's not that individual instance that we're so interested in, it's how they're all talking to one another in order to create even larger waves of impact. So there is a little bit of that judgment call, but that's how we're doing it. It's just, especially at the micro level, through individual interactions with our reporters.
And we did, early on in developing this work, with the strawberries story, we did something which is completely unrealistic to do regularly, but in that community, I think Cristina referenced this, we did a survey with, we worked with a university program of students from USC, University of Southern California, to do a survey ahead of time with residents in that community about their knowledge of the issue, and then after the reporting was in the Ventura County Star, that local paper, we also did a lot of work in Spanish language radio in that area too. We did a survey afterwards to see how people's awareness had changed, and it really had dramatically. We also delivered postcards to every household with our key findings, and that community was just not aware of the chemicals that they were being exposed to every day ahead of time. I mean, it's invisible, they didn't know. And afterwards we saw, I can't remember the percentages now, but it significantly increased awareness. So we can't do that on every project, but it showed us that if you work really hard to get the information to the people who need it, understanding can shift over time. So then there's kind of an assumption built in there that if you're getting some individual feedback that people have shifted their thinking or changed, that's probably happening on a broader level too. It's a little bit of guesswork, but.
I think, did you have a question? Yeah.
I wanted to ask, has this impact-driven approach increased your funding? And this 2 parts of that question, kind of your donor funding, but if you could talk a little bit about your membership and engagement and how this has had an impact that way.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about funding? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I would say it probably has increased our funding. We, so maybe 5-ish years ago, something like that, impact became the thing that funders in the US, funders of journalism, I mean, funders in every area care about. You need to be able to prove that you're making a difference and that you're worthy of their support for good reason, totally understandable. That did translate into journalism too, that's the fundamental question that people ask. And when we started being asked that question, like in the past, in my earlier years at CIR, we would always just say very vague, like our reporting changes laws and changes lives, but we had no way of proving it. And so we realized we had to get smarter about proving it. And we, with the help of this, of Lindsay, the fellow that we had, we realized we were in a position to be able to define that. I mean, the funders didn't know how to think about this for journalism organizations. They were basically saying, you tell us, what does impact mean to you? How do you measure it? How do you communicate it back? And so we tried to kind of define the space a little bit, and because we have been sharing this tool with so many other newsrooms, I think there's 40-something using it now, like collectively we feel like we've been in a place to define it for the funder community rather than funders defining it for us, and most funders have wanted that. You know, they've wanted us to, so we've sort of created collectively with all the newsrooms using it, a framework that I think a lot of funders have bought into, this whole idea of how you do it. So we have, I mean, the organization size has been pretty steady for the last 5 years, but we're getting more and more larger grants and multi-year grants, which didn't used to be the case. I think because there's more kind of trust and belief in our work over time that it's important. So it has become essential for fundraising for sure, and I think it has helped deepen our relationship with our existing funders and attracting new ones too.
And in terms of engagement, I mean, I think it's engagement which is actually tied to funding. I think we've become quite well known for creative engagement. So in addition to what you saw in terms of like the Amplify and the theater, we do comic strips for Instagram. We're actually putting a comic in the bus shelters in Philadelphia that actually gives data on redlining there. And we've also been incredibly collaborative in terms of sharing out how we do our engagement. Like we were working in New Jersey and Mississippi and all these places, and then really working with local newsrooms to share like what creative engagement looks like. And that also translates to how we even do our kind of engagement meetings. We do these things called design sprints, where our engagement team, the reporters and the editors all meet together early on in the investigation to, again, identify stakeholders, both like general audience to like particular individuals, and we think creatively about how and where those people are already getting their information in order to, again, creatively engage them. And that goes far beyond just like clicks and links on a page and more about really understanding it. And that is actually also linked to some of the funds that we're getting. We've gotten a lot of grants because of that creative work and because of our commitment to reaching communities.
About how you go about the problem of correlation and causation. Do you have it internally sometimes that a law is passed and then you argue, was this actually because of our reporting or would have it happened anyway? And how do you discuss this?
Yeah, we try to be careful. You know, there are, when we're lucky, literally the next day, like a senator will stand up and say, you know, this reporting from CIR, and we feel comfortable then saying it had an impact. We try to be careful in the language we use. If it's over time and it's obviously a piece of the puzzle and there's a lot of other things happening in the world, we can say our reporting helped lead to X, Y, Z. So, sometimes it's very clear, sometimes it's a little murkier, but we can at least say, here are the ways we know our reporting helped get to this place. But we try to be humble and not say it was all because of us.
Right. But we can also make inferences. Like, I don't know, when you're looking at the media, like our publication date, and then you see how many other outlets distribute it or start doing their own localizations, like that for us is an indicator that we started the conversation that is leading to people being aware of it.
And I'd say too, unlike a kind of daily news organization, often we're doing stories that nobody else is reporting on. Like we are creating an issue where there hasn't necessarily been one before. We're in a unique position in that way. And so it's not like 20 newsrooms are already reporting on this issue and who knows what part are played. Like the strawberry story, nobody else was reporting on that. So we can pretty clearly tie our work to whatever happens afterwards.
I think this side needs some love.
Thank you. You define yourself as an impact-driven newsroom. So I'm wondering how it has shifted journalist mindset and the way we practice journalism, starting by thinking of impact it may lead instead of starting with the idea or the stories.
Yeah.
So how journalists are picking stories and choosing stories that may lead to social change, and how is it in the newsroom?
Yeah, I'd say it took some time. Early on, that was very uncomfortable for a lot of reporters, for sure. But I think we have, proven ourselves over the years to be this kind of creative place and trying to do things in new ways. And so we attract journalists now who are interested in that. I mean, everyone who comes to work for us comes because we're doing all this like weird stuff. So they're bought in. I mean, some people have left over the years. I mean, even when we launched the radio show, like people thought we were crazy and that it was too big of an undertaking. And there's a few, really good reporters left CIR, and it was sad to see them go. They were accomplished, but it's like, this is where we're headed, and so you're on board with us or not. And even the older, more traditional, I don't mean old just in terms of age, but just the more traditional journalists, some people are more engaged in this than others. I mean, we find, I think the reporters who really own it are the ones who are more of kind of a type A personality. They want to be out there. They have big egos. They want people to know, like, I did this work and I'm getting credit for it. And there's other people who, prefer to be behind the scenes a little bit. So that's a bit of a, it's just an internal challenge of managing those different personalities. But I think, for us in the US, like the industry has just, collapsed and is being rebuilt now. And it's so many people are bringing so much creativity to thinking about the future of journalism that it doesn't feel abnormal anymore, I think, to be thinking in this way. And we still choose stories that we're going to do based on, like, what are the best stories. I mean, journalism is at the heart of everything. But if you have a choice between two and, two potential projects to work on, and one is going to affect more people, and there's clearly like things that could be done to fix the problem, I think it's an easy decision to go with that one for reporters. It's a piece of the decision making. It's not like it's not the only way we decide what to work on.
But I have to ask, why are you a journalist? What made you want to be a journalist? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What is journalism for? Yeah. Why people are choosing to enter that business, and what is it for? Yeah. And it's also the whole debate and discussion today, like the use of journalism for social goods or as a business, and so that's
yeah. Well, and I always say that I think people think that journalists are kind of cranky, and especially investigative reporters, that they're sort of pessimistic people. I actually think journalists are incredibly optimistic people. I mean, you do this work because you believe it's important. It's important for society. It's important for democracy, or at least democratic principles if you don't live in a democracy, and that it can make a difference. And I don't know that they all like to admit that they're actually optimistic, have a vision for a better future, but I think at the heart of it, that's why most people do this work, really. It's like to go after the bad guys. It's to like make the world better.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to understand what's the volume of the publications that you're doing, how many themes you're having at the same time, and how many pieces of articles, videos, whatever you're producing are actually putting out every day, every week, every month. What's the frequency?
Yes, so the radio show is our most frequent. So that's every week, 1 hour. Like, we have to do it or there's going to be nothing on the radio. So that's the most consistent. Most of our journalists, there's like 25-ish, 30 investigative reporters. Most people are doing 1 or 2 big projects a year. And everyone's expected to do a blog post here and there. I mean, we're not a like newspaper or daily news organization, so it's not like a kind of site that people would come to every day. We try to go where people are and then bring them back to us to go deeper into our reporting. So we have something new probably every every week?
I think every week with our blog posts recently, I think we've been getting a lot of hits, just also because of Trump. Like, we are often responding to something, so I think our pickup has been a little more than usual, but our long investigations, like Christa is saying, it's a luxury. Our reporters really get to dig in for a year or more. Yeah? Is that, oh.
My question is about the impact of the new technology and the digital tools on the way of investigating, because since last 10 years the journalism has changed like in a lot of terms, but there was like traditional investigation that you have sources, you got a document in the government and to reveal the corruption or scandals or something. But now it's more into the big data and the digital tools, augmented reality, virtual reality, and there's so many tools too. So how it has impacted and how it will be in the future on the way of investigations, and how it will be the future of the new technology, especially on the investigation.
If we had a golden ball.
I know.
I mean, for us now, we've got a team of 5 data reporters, I think 5, the team, 4 data reporters, who both do their own projects and work with the rest of our newsroom. And just as an example, like the Kept Out project was like the perfect kind of project for us, because it involved these 31 million records about home loans basically made across the country. I mean, no matter it was about every neighborhood, every country, every city, every state, every neighborhood in the entire country, and could be localized anywhere, by news organizations, by individual people, and that's like the perfect project for us. It's rare, and it's completely possible because of the movement towards data-driven reporting. I mean, we got all those records, but we worked for, I don't know, maybe a year to make them make sense and be consistent. And that's, it's only possible through all of these technology tools. And so we try to look for those projects, but it's, they're kind of few and far between. So for us, it allows us to tell these big stories. I mean, I think it's essential to doing, and we still do some stories that are based on, someone handing someone a document. I mean, that happens too. But the scale of stories we can tell now is just so different with access to technology tools.
I mean, we have a whole data team, and they are trained very differently than some of our print and radio reporters, right? They're doing statistical regression models in order to be able to look at 31 million records and actually glean some insights from it. So I think what you're maybe getting at is like new tools, new skills, different way of approaching like source material. And again, we're really lucky to have a team of 4 people that have different skill sets but can respond to data in a way that the rest of the newsroom can't. And I also think that there's some reporters, we're partnering with academic institutions more and more, and trying to see like what are the linkages between journalists and PhDs that are have very interesting methodologies, but maybe can't be doing or have enough time to go a certain avenue. And I think in the future from CIR, there's going to be a lot of exciting collaborations that
that's a good point. We launched this about a year ago, and there's a lot of researchers that have access to data that journalists can't get, and so it's a really great partnership for both sides, because we get information we wouldn't be able to get otherwise, and they get to, by working with us, stories are told, they're able to reach an audience with their work that's just so much broader than academics can typically reach on their own.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what could be an effective way to track the impact of an individual freelance journalist's story?
Well,
So,
interesting.
I mean, I am a freelance journalist, and I do not have any sort of newsroom or group of people. I work alone or sometimes together with 1 or 2 colleagues. So it's it looks quite difficult to track the impact of a story, but it could be quite important also in order to, I don't know, probably to improve our reliability or something else.
That's really interesting. I don't know if an individual has ever gotten the impact tracker for themselves, but again, like the tool is it's the framework, right? And it's customizable for you. So this could definitely work for a freelancer if you wanted to just use it, create your own tracking method. So I don't know what macro would look like for you or micro, but you could track like, my story, went to this outlet and then this outlet and then this outlet in this time. Based on that partnership, I'm looking at the timeline, looks like Le Monde now wants me. Like you could start tracking the way that your partnerships and where your stories are going for your personal work. But then the onus would be on you if you want to look at the outcomes of your individual stories and tracking that impact. But it could work. In fact, that's actually a really interesting case study. You should do it and then tell us about it. Well, great. I think we're wrapping up. I think it's like 2 minutes. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And let us know if you have questions.
Thanks.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So this will take you to, yeah, it's a bit.ly. Oh, there it is. So that's the form. But if you go to www.revealnews.org/, I think, impact tracker, you'll find it. But email us if nothing else, and we'll gladly talk to you more about it.